You see, actually, the seats in the front are most expensive, but since no one bought the most expensive tickets, I'll just move closer. It's nice to be back at Melbourne Uni. I'm going to be talking about something I presented at Stanford University last month. And yes, we're going to talk about consciousness, but in particular, we're going to talk about consciousness as pleasure beyond time and space. This is a very important subject matter for our current human situation because, as so many of you know, simply conceiving of pleasure in terms of physical acquisition and physical interaction has placed such a burden on the planet as people compete for scarce resources, the population expands. So how much can physicality hold for us? You're dealing with finite resources. You're dealing with one planet, as Stephen Hawking describes a planet, though, and your presence on it. You may agree with that, or you may not. Let's face it, the human race is just a chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet, orbiting around a very average star in the outer suburb of one among hundreds of billions of galaxies. In any case, the chemical scum these days has some problems. Perhaps those problems originate with a mistaken conception of what is the self. This is the information that the ancient yoga texts present. The self is actually non-physical. And the symptom of that non-physical existence of the self is consciousness. That we have such a difficult scientific time trying to understand consciousness should let us know, the ancient seers say, that there is something about the core self which is beyond the laws of time and space. Conscious awareness, where is the scientific instrument that can directly detect the presence of consciousness? There's none. In fact, I often quote in universities that I speak around the world a reference from the International Dictionary of Psychology. And at least up until very recently, when you looked up consciousness, the International Dictionary of Psychology said, consciousness, no one really knows anything about it. Nothing worthwhile has ever been written about it. That's the entry. Hopefully things have been upgraded in the past few years. Why is understanding consciousness so relevant for you and the world's situation? Because unless people develop a non-material conception of pleasure, they're literally going to drive one another crazy, and it could be they drive the human race into extinction. Because as long as everyone is focused on physicality, they're going to deal with limitations. But not only will they deal with limitations, but also they're going to deal with dissatisfaction. So this is an important contribution that yoga psychology makes. You cannot be satisfied with matter because your core being is not material. In other words, thinking that matter can satisfy us. And when I say matter, I'm referring to all kinds of physical interactions, whether subtle or very grossly apparent. Thinking that such can satisfy you is like you're driving into a petrol station and deciding you need to be fulfilled, you need to be happy, so you take the nozzle of the pump and you stick it in your mouth and fill yourself up. This is insanity, of course. But according to the ancient yoga texts, it's a similar insanity to think that matter can actually fulfill and satisfy us. So if we can solve this basic mistake at the beginning of the equation, we'll save ourselves so much trouble. But as long as we think that the body is the self, and indeed, the yoga texts take it further, even considering the mind to be the self, causes such havoc in our personal life and in the life of society. So let's consider. We're on a hunt for real pleasure. We're on a hunt for real satisfaction. If the individuals in society cannot latch on to real happiness and satisfaction, there's going to be a lot of turmoil, there's going to be a lot of frustration, and indeed, in that mistaken quest for material satisfaction, so much pressure is put on the environment. In other words, we can easily see today that nature can't handle our pursuit of happiness. We're already living, as many of you know, as if we're on at least 1.5 planet Earths. So, we're looking at particularly the yoga texts like Bhagavad-Gita, where Krishna gives very lucid understanding of the core problem and what is the core self. Before going to the presentation of Bhagavad-Gita and its postgraduate study, Srimad Bhagavatam, which takes all the themes of Bhagavad-Gita and expands upon them, let's talk a bit about sectarianism and non-sectarianism. When I first began studying this knowledge of antiquity and its contemporary application, I was at Yale University in the early 70s, and my professors said, all right, for you, you can study whatever you like. We drop all of what's called in the USA distribution requirements, you know. We have to take one of this course, one of that course, so on and so forth. They said, you can study whatever you want because we see you're looking for the truth. We wish that we would have done such when we were students, but we weren't brave enough. But anyway, you can go for it. You can milk this university for all it's worth and see what you come up with. So I did. And in the course of my investigations, I happened upon Bhagavad-Gita. I was particularly interested because right in the beginning of Bhagavad-Gita, Krishna describes what is the crucial problem we're going through. Mistaken identity. Because we conceive of ourselves as matter, naturally our goals in life are going to be based on that perception or conception, and therefore, if indeed we are not matter, we're going to have quite a rocky time trying to be satisfied through material pursuits. Is this information sectarian or is it universal? Allow me to quote one verse from chapter 2 of Bhagavad-Gita, where Krishna explains. I'll quote the Sanskrit, not to display that I have knowledge of an ancient language, but just to show that this is authentic knowledge that's been accumulated over. Actually, no one knows when such texts originated. So, Dehi nosmin yata dehe komalam yuvanam jara. Tata dehantara praptiya dhiras tatra namuyati. This ancient Sanskrit verse describes that the core spiritual identity transits in this lifetime from childhood to youth to adulthood to middle ages to old age and death. Similarly, death is a transit to another body. What has taken birth must die, and what has died must take birth. This is, in a nutshell, what people popularly refer to as reincarnation. What we want to focus on today is the universality of this knowledge. Whether you call yourself this religion or that religion, or this ethnicity or that ethnicity, or this nationality or that nationality, no matter what your passport says, what is it about you that doesn't change, although the body is changing? Now, if we got all religions of diversity together, all ethnicities of diversity together, and focused on this issue, what is it that doesn't change, although the body changes from childhood to youth to adulthood, so on and so forth? What is it that doesn't change? Then we can actually build a platform of universal understanding and indeed even unity. You see, it's very difficult. In fact, it's impossible to build unity on the material platform. There's too much diversity, both temporary and lasting a lifetime. People call themselves so many labels and designations, changing them sometimes like fashions, but also some designations or labels stick with you all your life. Just like, what's an example of a changing designation? Or accumulation of designation. I was born an American citizen, but now I'm a double citizen, both American and New Zealand. So, what's the appropriate label for me? If I look at my genetic background, I find there's some European, there's some American Indian, there's some African American. Which one am I? Someone can be male, someone can be female, and that can also change, although generally it doesn't. So we're living in a swirling situation of labels. And then our body is changing. It used to be thought that all the cells in the body change except in the brain. Now, there is substantial indication that the brain cells also change. So, how, amidst all this change, can there be a constant sense of self? What is it about you that doesn't change, although labels change? Designations change, nationalities change, genders can change. The mind is also changing all the time. What is fixed? So this is the non-sectarian universal point that Krishna makes in Bhagavad-Gita. Consider what doesn't change, although there's so much change going on. Whether you call yourself this religion or that religion, atheist, this nationality, that nationality, whatever. What doesn't change, although your body is always changing? Let's adopt for a moment the religion of the materialist, because materialism is also a religious belief. According to that religion, just think for a moment about the time you were born. And then think, because you actually can't remember your birth, but just try to imagine now. Where were you before you were born? Now, move ahead in time to after your death. Where will you be? What is the church scientific answer? The materialist religion answer? Where will you be after death? The same as where you were before birth. The brutal answer is nowhere. Your life is just a brief journey on earth that started one day for no reason, and it will inevitably end. But anyway, just focus on the journey. Like the whole universe, your consciousness popped into existence out of nothingness. And it has evolved since then into a rich and complex entity full of wonder and mystery. So what do you think? How can consciousness emerge from nothingness? What are the odds? First, what is consciousness anyway? Scientists have a tough time resolving that question. There are some who say, we are sure, even though there's no proof whatsoever, that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain. There are others who say, although you can find neural correlates, you can find activity in the brain that corresponds to conscious awareness, you can't say one-to-one that there is such a direct correlation that one equals the other. And then the third group of scientists says, look, we don't know, just face it, we don't know. What group will we subscribe to? Most persons say, why think about it? Even though we can't solve the big issues, there's lots of smaller issues in life to deal with. And that's where our attention should be focused upon, the small things. The big questions, what difference in your bank balance does it make if you solve the big questions? What difference does it make down here on the ground? What Krishna presents in Bhagavad-Gita is that grappling with the big questions makes an extraordinary difference in life. Because if you are, at your core being, non-material, then why should you waste your time struggling for material happiness and fulfillment? And if indeed you are matter, then actually what does it matter what you do? In your home, in your kitchen sink, you wash down the drain so much dirty dishwater, you don't lament about it. So then, and Krishna makes this point in Bhagavad-Gita also, if you consider that the self is just temporary matter, then why worry about anything? Why take your life so valuably? Just face the brutal answer, as Mr. Hawking said. You're just chemical scum going down the drain of your kitchen sink. Why does the chemical scum take itself so seriously? This is neurotic. So now we have chemical scum at Melbourne Uni trying to understand what it should do and hoping to earn a livelihood in the future to support the chemical scum. Who really can live like this? But you are being asked to accept the brutal fact. Once we start to consider consciousness, we have a very fast motorway that will lead us, if we truly follow the road to the end. It will lead us to understanding our core identity as a non-material particle of consciousness. Now the Vedic texts take it even further. Once you have that foundational understanding of the non-material self, then you can understand the non-material nature of ultimate reality and your relationship with it. You have some awareness, but no one here will claim to be aware of everything. You are aware to some degree of what goes on in your body, but you're not aware of what goes on in the person's body right next to you. Your consciousness doesn't extend that far. Your awareness is limited. Can there also be a supreme consciousness of which we are particles? And what is the relationship between the particle and this complete whole? This is the subject of the yoga texts like Bhagavad-Gita. Once we acknowledge the existence of consciousness, as the symptom of a non-material reality, then we can really begin a different kind of lifestyle, a different kind of understanding, indeed a different kind of pleasure. Let's drop back to the church scientific, the scientific dogmas of today. If you say that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain, then it makes the odds of your own consciousness existing the same as the odds of your being born in the first place. Those odds are very small when seen from the materialistic paradigm. How did a creature like you take birth? Well, how did a creature like you have consciousness? The odds against such things happening are so tiny. I was just reading one scientific magazine, New Scientist, which was urging that since it is a fact that the odds of your being born at all are so small, and the odds of your consciousness existing are also so small, therefore, and I quote, just think of that next time you suffer angst about your impending return to nothingness. Since your return to nothingness is impending, you can comfort yourself knowing that in the first place your odds for being born were so tiny, and in the second place your odds for having consciousness were so tiny, so don't worry, it doesn't actually matter. But no one can live like this. There's something propelling every one of you here to enjoy and have pleasure and fulfillment. None of you are going to hook up with a partner by saying, hey, chemical scum, let's get together. Or, why not journey with me on our impending return to nothingness? Not a very palatable invitation for sharing a life together. So, we need to consider these things. Who are we? Again, the issue, am I matter or am I something beyond matter? In the past, that question was solely addressed by philosophers. Today, however, it's often geneticists who are studying our DNA for clues of our identity. Neuroscientists, however, disagree. They often say that the essence of our personhood is not so much in the genetic code, but in the way 100 billion neurons in our brains are wired to one another. There's so many things about you that are not preordained by your DNA. Your genome is, the content of genome is fixed, whereas neurons, they're plastic, their relationships are very changey, they're constantly creating and destroying connections with one another, and they contain varying amounts of electrical sparks that are spiking through them. So all this is going on. Shouldn't we look at the brain as the solution? If we can some or other figure out a complete snapshot of every neural connection in the human brain, then we've got everything understood. We've got the essence of personhood. Are you sure, though? First of all, how possible is it to map out every neural connection in the human brain? I'll give you an example, and then we'll talk about the human brain problem in of itself. In 1986 was published the first and only definitive map of an entire neural complexity. This was done for the nervous system of a roundworm that is 1 millimeter long. Now, the the roundworm is 1 millimeter long, you can just understand what the brain substance, how big it is. In any case, this roundworm that's 1 millimeter long has 302 neurons, which have 7,000 connections. For scientists to map out those connections, it took 12 years. That's for one worm, 1 millimeter long, with 302 neurons, which have 7,000 connections. To trace them out and map them, it took 12 years. Now, human beings have 100 billion neurons. Just to map a cubic millimeter of the human brain, using the same example, comparing it to the roundworm, it would take 1 million person years just to map a cubic millimeter of your brain. So, somehow or other, one day it may be possible by even more advanced computers, but once you understand the brain, you've mapped everything out, all the neurons, the neural pathways, then you've also got to deal with the chemical bath in which the neurons sit. That's also shifting. Once you do all that, have you actually understood consciousness? In other words, why should we be so sure that consciousness equals the brain and the brain equals consciousness? This is an important point because our materialistic creed rests on this bedrock that somehow or other consciousness emerges from physicality. There's no proof for that. There's no proof that consciousness emerges from any physical system, whether a brain or otherwise. Whether you say consciousness comes from neural pathways, neural connections, or subatomic particles, or magical quantum fields, this is all conjecture. The ancient Veda texts cut right to the chase. We're looking in the wrong way. We're trying to produce the non-material out of the material. So let's just save ourselves so much trouble and call a spade a spade. I'd like to share with you some information I spoke about at Melbourne Uni many years ago, 10 years ago, and it caused a bit of an uproar. I spoke about scientifically documented information concerning the medical study of hydranencephalics, persons who indeed have no brain substance. In place of the brain, in their heads, is simply cerebrospinal fluid. That's all. This information has been around since the 70s, but it's very conveniently forgotten, although so well documented in peer-reviewed journals. In the first case, a neurologist, John Lorber, at the University of Sheffield in the UK, found 2 children who had no brain. There was just fluid there. If you took a light and shined it on one side of the child's head, the light would pass through cleanly to the other side. So neither child had any brain substance, yet both were normal in their mental functions. But how can this be? How can you be a whole person without a brain? You would immediately think, if the person's still alive, the person must be severely impaired and debilitated. But this is not the case. So, obviously this discovery caused a flurry at the time, but because it's so challenging, it was forgotten. So this neurologist continued his studies, and soon he had assembled a test group of patients in which more than 95% of their head, their cranium, lacked brain substance. In other words, you could fairly say that their skull was empty. Some of the persons in the group were severely disabled, but half of them had IQs greater than 100. And basically, there's no brain. If you want to be very, very, very particular, you could say that they had 2% gray matter. Like a rind of an orange was there. It doesn't end there, however. The challenge to the brain dogma. At that same university where this neurologist, John Lorber, was doing his research, he came in contact, by way of a medical doctor, an extraordinary situation. A brilliant student, top of his class, happened to visit his local doctor. And the doctor noticed, your head is larger than usual. I have a friend who's a neurologist doing research. Would you mind, just letting him, scan your head and just for his research purposes? So the student, of course, said, hey, whatever, let's aid scientific progress. When the student's head was scanned, what was discovered, and this is documented in first-rate scientific journals, what was discovered? That inside his head was nothing, no brain. Yet, the student had an IQ of 126 and was the top student in mathematics in his class. What to make of this? Obviously, there's something about consciousness that can exist without the brain. You can safely say, perhaps, that consciousness is related to the brain. It has some obvious neural correlates. But at the same time, you also have to say, it seems that in some cases, consciousness can be present without the brain. This is very, very unsettling. So much so that the last time I presented this at Melbourne Uni, one professor afterwards came up to me, all right, where are your sources? I've got to see that. I can't believe this. This is too much. I said, well, you please follow me back to the flat where I stay, and I'll show it to you. And indeed he did. And indeed I showed him. And when he saw the documentation, he, oh my God. Yes, it is quite paradigm shattering. Of course, these things are not discussed too often because they cause such a commotion in our conceptions. The hope to understand the self these days is always attributed to the brain. But this is dogma. This is a faith which the yoga texts don't accept. There's no doubt that if you map all the neural connections in the brain, it'll be a tremendous step forward to understanding the brain. But as Krishna explains in Bhagavad-Gita, you still haven't understood the self. Just consider, if you are simply the brain, then there are all sorts of radical solutions you could look forward to in life. You could, for example, spend $200,000 to a company called Alcor, which practices cryonics, freezing clients at the time of death in liquid nitrogen. And then they promise to thaw you out when scientists can repair and revive your neural pathways. $200,000. What do you think? As soon as you die, you're frozen in liquid nitrogen, and there's a written document, you paid your money, that as soon as scientists figure out how to repair your neural pathways, because you are the brain, they'll promise to, they'll thaw you out and get you going again. Now, you may not have that kind of money, 200,000 USD. What's that about? 190,000 Aussie these days. So, if you want to save money, they'll agree to just saw off your head for 80,000 and save it. They'll freeze it, And then when the scientific breakthroughs come, they'll thaw out your head and you'll come back to life once all the neural pathways are mapped and all the neural secrets are understood. You can still go further though with your material dreams. You can become a transhumanist. Now, what is a transhumanist? That is someone who sees that understanding the neural pathways is not simply the key for survival, it's also the key for going beyond the body, outlasting the body. In other words, transhumanists consider that if the neural circuits can be perfectly known and all the interactions between the neurons in you are perfectly known, then you can upload that information onto a computer and you'll live happily ever after as a simulation. Not very appealing, is it? So, perhaps it's much better for us to consider the non-material nature of the self and consciousness as an indicator of the non-material reality. So this is what Krishna presents in Bhagavad-Gita, and this is actually the basis of real yoga. So many times we think of yoga as simply physical exercises, breathing exercises. And indeed it is that, but that's the minimum level. The purpose of the physical exercises is not simply for losing weight or toning muscles. All that is good, I do it myself. But the real purpose of the physical exercises, called the asanas, is to make your mind peaceful so that you can start thinking about who you are. The purpose of the breathing exercises is to calm your mind so that you can properly focus on what is the ultimate goal in life. And then you can consider such foundational issues as, who am I? Am I matter or am I non-material? That question so profoundly affects the rest of your life in terms of your goals, how you try to fulfill yourself, how you try to satisfy yourself. And indeed, that question affects all of human society. If you have the billions existing on the planet today who are convinced that they need matter to satisfy themselves, whether the matter is in the form of silicon chips or oil or bodily flesh, you're putting an enormous strain on other living entities, on resources, upon ecosystems. How do you get human beings to chill out, calm down, slacken their grip from this pursuit of happiness as they see it, mistakenly so? You have to give them something better to do. What will that better thing be? There's so much discussion these days that since economic growth seems to be grinding to a halt in the world, globally speaking, there may be places here and there where there's some spurts. Australia has its mineral ores for some time, although last week the newspapers were saying it could be there's just a really 2-year boom left. In any case, what are you going to replace the religion of economic growth with? What does materialism, thinking we are matter and our life's goals are material, what does that have to offer for replacing the enormous drive for economic growth? What will human beings do when economic growth may no longer be a reality? What will become the central reason for their life beyond survival? In other words, how are they going to be happy? How are they going to enjoy it? Consumerism can't be accommodated. Any environmentalist knows that. what to do. This is the practicality of the ancient Vedic wisdom. If you understand that your pleasure is non-material, then you don't put a strain on others. You don't put a strain on the ecosystem. You are tasting another reality. Just like consciousness indicates another reality, similarly, the pleasure of interaction between the individual consciousness and the supreme consciousness is indeed another reality, which can't be taxed, it can't be stolen, it can't be politicized, you can't make a monopoly on it, you can't start trade wars over it, you can't start oil wars over it. In other words, if we can distribute a mass awareness of non-material happiness, which is factual, this will be a great step forward. Indeed, the greatest step forward in solving the practical problems of the world. Just look at yourself individually. You have hopes for pleasure. I don't think anyone here is longing for misery and distress. Everyone here is a pleasure-seeking entity. Now, how do you have that drive for pleasure? Where does it originate? Does it originate in matter? Or is it the natural quality of the spirit self? The ancient yoga texts hold that indeed your quest for pleasure is the symptom of a conscious entity. And the natural pleasure of the individual conscious entity is in relation to the supreme conscious entity. Many of you have heard the word Krishna. The exact Sanskrit definition of Krishna means the all-attractive reservoir of pleasure. In other words, the supreme consciousness is infinitely pleasurable. And although we are finite and tiny as particles of consciousness, we, in connection to the reservoir of pleasure, we derive unlimited happiness, even though we are limited. So this is what Bhagavad-Gita is presenting. The non-material happiness, which has no limitation, originating in our connection to the supreme source of pleasure. So once you start to acknowledge your non-material identity, once you allow consciousness to take you to that conclusion, then you can begin to understand the supreme consciousness and the relationship between the two. So the emphasis on consciousness, if you follow through on the motorway all the way to the end, takes you into a completely different mode of living. Once we give up our physicality hang-up, that everything in the universe is physical, everything that we'll ever discover in the universe is going to be physical, this is the church scientific. This is religious dogma. Think how much trouble we could save ourselves by just adopting another route. One last point. When the ancient Vedic texts, like Bhagavad-Gita, present consciousness as indicator of the non-material self, do they give any procedures for verification, or is it just believe? I dealt with this extensively when I spoke at Stanford last month. Naturally, persons are afraid of belief, even though there's so much materialistic dogma that people unconsciously accept as fact. What is there in Bhagavad-Gita that will allow us entrance into the non-material reality? I explained at Stanford that nowhere in Bhagavad-Gita does Krishna say, just believe. Everywhere in the Gita, as it's known for short, Krishna says, here is the laboratory procedure. You apply it, here are the results you get. So I asked the students there, isn't that fair enough? Now, whether you want to enter this particular laboratory or not, that's up to you. But if the procedure is presented, doesn't that indicate that this could be very substantial knowledge? And perhaps if you felt motivated, you could indeed enter that laboratory, take up the procedures, and see if you can verify the results? So most of them agreed, this is fair enough, fair enough. But I recognized, what is clouding the issue, so to speak? It's something called the Materialistic Creed. And I'd like to recite it with you. These are the bedrock assumptions of so-called normal life. I don't know if any of you have ever recited a religious creed, or you've, for example, in the USA, before school starts, you put your hand over your heart and you face the American flag and you recite a Pledge of Allegiance. You don't do anything like that in Australia, do you? You have to put your hand on the heart, stand up, face the flag, and you say, I pledge allegiance, let's see if I still remember. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So, every morning before school starts, you got to do that. Well, we don't do that here, but we do have our creed, consciously or unconsciously. So let's solemnly intone this creed. I'll recite it. Or maybe we can recite it together, in unison. I believe in the material universe as the only and ultimate reality. A universe controlled by fixed physical laws and blind chance. I assume that the universe has no creator. No objective purpose, and no objective meaning or destiny. I maintain that all ideas about God or gods, enlightened beings, prophets or saviors, or other non-physical beings or forces, are superstitions and delusions. I profess that life and consciousness are totally identical to physical processes and arose from chance interactions of blind physical forces. Like the rest of life, my life and my consciousness have no objective purpose, meaning or destiny. I believe that all judgments, values, and moralities, whether my own or others, are subjective, arising solely from biological determinants, personal history and chance. I maintain that free will is an illusion. Therefore, the most rational values I can personally live by must be based on the knowledge that for me, what pleases me is good. What pains me is bad. Those who please me or help me avoid pain, are my friends. Those who pain me or keep me from my pleasure are my enemies. Rationality requires that friends and enemies be used in ways that maximize my pleasure and minimize my pain. I affirm that spiritual organizations, cultures, or groups have no real use other than social support and welfare. That there are no sins to commit or be forgiven for. And that there is no divine retribution for sin and no reward for virtue. Virtue for me is getting what I want without being caught or punished by others. I assume that the death of the body is the death of the self. There's no afterlife, and all hope of such is nonsense. Very good. Now have a blissful life. Coming from nothingness and returning to nothingness. No, you really don't think that way. There's something in you that longs for existence without cessation and happiness and fulfillment that is not spoiled by time. So therefore, the ancient yoga texts, such as Bhagavad-Gita, invite you to the realm of consciousness and the pleasure of consciousness in relation to the supreme consciousness. You are a tiny particle of consciousness. Would it be wrong to posit that there could be a source of all consciousness? And that conscious source is the source of all pleasure. If you can connect with that conscious source of pleasure, then your pursuit of happiness will happily end. In that there's no need to search for water in the desert of material existence. You can actually connect with the supreme, all-attractive consciousness. This is what Krishna is speaking about in Bhagavad-Gita and other Vedic texts. And it is of the greatest practical concern for all humanity. Because unless we find non-material sources of happiness, we're going to continue to burden the earth. As you know, human beings have become the first species to spoil its own habitat. We have to do something, but what to do? This material solution, that material solution, reorganize the political system, reorganize the economic system. Is that really going to change the human beings to such an extent that they become a benign presence on the earth planet? The ancient Vedic texts say, no, we have to look in another direction. We've got to get off the material bandwagon, and we've got to face the realities of consciousness. That consciousness signifies the non-material identity, the non-material self. And furthermore, the non-material self is part of the supreme non-material self, and there's a relationship between the two. In Sanskrit, that relationship between the individual non-material self and the supreme non-material self, the relationship is called bhakti. In Sanskrit, that means pure love and devotion, unaffected by time and space. So this is where the Hare Krishna mantra is leading to. It's not just a fun song. It has extraordinary import and significance. And if we can learn this science of non-material happiness, that is the greatest acquisition in life. That's the greatest wealth. So I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you very much. Might there be any questions? I could go on for some time, but we have a fixed time, and we also have a very delicious lunch to offer to you. Yes?
I'm just kind of interested, what is your opinion on, because we know that humans evolved, like, you know, a few billion years ago, and we can see that as we evolved, our brains got bigger, and consciousness is obviously attached to our brains somehow. So, what are your thoughts on human beings being, like, arising on the earth along with the brain and consciousness? How does it all tie in?
Okay. I don't see that it ties in at all, because until you show me the evolutionary procedures and steps for the development of consciousness, I can't buy it. I can't buy it. I have to see the steps for how consciousness evolved. And then, even before I get that far, I have to see how consciousness is for sure a physical something that is subject to evolution.
Well, we know that gorillas aren't conscious, and we know that our ancestors originated from gorillas.
I don't know about, I would say go to the zoo. I've been to the Melbourne Zoo, it's great, and I've studied the animals there. In terms of awareness, I wouldn't say that I know gorillas have, you know, they lack consciousness. They seem, I've studied them. I'm sure there are biologists here who have studied them much more than me, but I saw the gorillas at the Melbourne Zoo. They were having a good time. Sometimes kissing, sometimes hugging, you know, things you see on the campus here, they were doing. So, anyway, let's cut to the chase. I appreciate your question, but there's some assumptions underneath there which are actually dogmatic. So I've hinted throughout my presentation why there's some dogma attached to those assumptions. It's okay to have religious assumptions, but those assumptions are of the materialistic church scientific. That consciousness is indeed material, and that therefore it's bound up by time and space, and it has developed through the process of evolution. I respect that belief, but I call it what it is. It's a religious belief. Anything else? Thank you for the question.
I'd just like to follow on from that question. I agree that there are some high primates which, like humans, have consciousness. They can recognise themselves in mirrors, and they can also be aware of the continuity of themselves over time. But you asked to be shown where the arrival of consciousness is demonstrated in biology, in evolution. Well, I'm suggesting that you look at an infant. I think that it happens every time. You know, an infant is born and grows up. We start off with an infant that's just born, doesn't have any conscious awareness, and it is part of the brain's development that it establishes consciousness. And if you study and look at the evolving awareness of a child, you will see those steps that occur. You know, the child, first of all, doesn't have any awareness of its as a separate being from its chief caregiver, its parents. It considers itself, well, if it has any thoughts, it doesn't have any distinction. And slowly it becomes aware that it is a separate entity to other entities. And as far as a child is concerned, if something leaves its sight, it doesn't exist anymore. And there is, you know, a lot of evidence to show that the development of a child becoming aware of the continued existence of objects that are outside its field of view. And this is all about, you know, the evolution of conscious awareness.
Okay. Now, are you talking to me about the development of awareness, or are we going from zero to something? Are you talking about how the child may have primitive awareness, which, from our point of view, externally, that is, it becomes more extensive, or at childbirth, all of a sudden you go from nothing to something?
No, at conception you have absolutely zero. At conception, there's zero. You have
this is the conception these days, although the Vedic text will disagree, but
look,
we can't argue about that because there's no proof.
I would suggest that we have a continuum of awareness, which is all of the primates. We are a primate. We may like to think that we're not, but we're primates. We exist on a continuum. And, you know, at one end of the continuum is absolutely no awareness, and at the other end is, you know, our high-level awareness, which is humans. And babies start somewhere low down, lower than other higher-order primates. And their awareness
that's a good point.
As they go along.
Yes, so I think what we need to do is figure out what is consciousness to begin with, whether it's at that end of the continuum or the other end. This is my point. In other words, I'm jumping outside the box. I know I'm being naughty, but I'm jumping way outside the box. I'm not the only one who does this, by the way. I can quote Nobel scientists who also jump outside this box. Thank you.
I have a question. I totally agree about this consciousness thing, but I was just thinking, what would be your perception about whether animals, insects, they do have this consciousness as well? Yeah.
You're really pinning me down, huh?
No, I'm not. I'm just...
In Bhagavad-Gita, the point is made that all living entities are conscious to varying degrees. There's a continuum. Some are lesser in terms of their development of consciousness, some have more. So therefore, in the yoga texts like the Upanishads, so much pressure is put on the human form of life because it's said to have the maximum development of consciousness. But if human beings waste their gift of developed consciousness to pursue the same goals as animals in a more sophisticated way, this is a great loss. So I'm presenting a particular angle in answer to your question, that all living entities are conscious, but some living entities, their consciousness is so undeveloped that it seems like it's not there at all. So therefore, if we consider human beings, what are they doing? If they misuse their gift of advanced consciousness just to pursue goals like eating, sleeping, reproduction, defending, this is a great loss from the ancient Vedic viewpoint. That's how I would answer your question. Now, if you want to verify the consciousness presence in other species of life than humans, well, you need to enter a different laboratory.
like develop this consciousness in them as well?
Can we develop what?
This consciousness.
Which consciousness?
The consciousness that we have, like, you know, because you say that the animal might have a little lesser to a human. So is there a way that we can cultivate this kind of like consciousness to make them develop their consciousness so that they could like
Yeah. She's asking if there's some way we can help other species of life to develop their consciousness.
Because you see, sometimes people connect with animals.
One would have to be a very powerful spiritual conscious person to do that. But at least you can start with human beings. They're the most destructive species on the planet right now. So if you can uplift the human beings and get them to be more conscious of their higher consciousness, you'd be doing a great thing for society.
So I was actually going to ask, how do you nurture your conscious self?
Thank you. Beautiful question. First, some knowledge is required. That's why you're at the university, you're getting knowledge. There's another kind of knowledge, though. There's knowledge of physicality and there's knowledge of non-physicality. My gripe with universities as I travel the world and speak at them is the stress on knowledge of physicality. If I had time, I would go into a whole presentation about that. How it actually doesn't work in terms of our understanding the universe. But I don't have the time to do that now. Therefore, suffice to say, we begin with knowledge. Authentic knowledge of non-physicality, of the spiritual entity. And then we need laboratory experience. Otherwise we get too religious belief, you know. If we are not the body, there should be techniques to verify our spiritual existence. But those techniques are not the techniques of science as we know it. What Krishna gives in Bhagavad-Gita as procedure for verifying non-material reality, this is not science as ordinarily accepted. But I think that you'll find, if indeed with an open mind you apply those techniques, you will indeed verify your non-material existence and the existence of the supreme spiritual reality and the relationship between the two. So basically, what do we want to achieve with our life? That's what it comes down to. I recommend the chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra, a sound vibration extraordinaire, which actually cleanses the consciousness of material illusion and revives your connection with the ultimate reality, the reservoir of pleasure, with Krishna. But that's a step beyond what we're talking about today. We're just trying to lay the groundwork today. And by the way, no one's going to challenge me about the no-brain persons? Don't disappoint me. 126 IQ, top mathematics student at the University of Sheffield, no brain. What happened to evolution in terms of consciousness? This is documented in first-rate scientific journals. It's not like, tabloid stuff. So as I said the last time I mentioned this at Melbourne Uni, some years ago, a professor very appropriately pulled me up on it. Okay, where are the sources? I said, come on, I'll show you. I showed it to him. Oh my God. Oh no. Any other questions? So again, I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you very much.